24 hours inside the most dangerous prison in the world. The gate that never opens. It starts before sunrise. A convoy of armored vans crawls through the desert, tires grinding against gravel as a crimson dawn breaks over a barren horizon. Ahead, surrounded by steel fences, concrete walls, and miles of razor wire, stands a fortress that the press once called Hell on Earth. Officially, it's known as the ADX Florence Federal Supermax prison in Colorado. But among inmates and correctional officers alike, it has another name, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Every inch of this place was built to crush escape attempts and silence defiance. Motion sensors line the perimeter. Cameras never blink. Doors operate on magnetic locks controlled from a sealed command center. Inside, over 400 of the most dangerous men in America live under near-total isolation. Each cell, 8 by 10 feet, is a concrete box with a steel door and a narrow slit for light. A single mistake here doesn't just cost you your job, it could cost your life. According to Bureau of Prisons reports, the facility was designed in 1994 after multiple violent incidents at other federal penitentiaries. Officials claimed they needed a place to control the uncontrollable. That phrase became a blueprint for a new era of incarceration, one built entirely on control through sensory deprivation. At 5:30 a.m., the first buzzers sound. Inmates awaken not to the clatter of keys but to the hum of electronics, automated systems unlocking food slots and activating intercoms. Guards don't shout orders here, they speak through microphones, invisible but omnipresent. No face-to-face contact. No human warmth. Just a voice and a wall. One officer, identified in Department of Justice training records only as Officer Reynolds, described his first day here. It's like walking into a laboratory, not a prison. Every movement, every breath, is calculated. Breakfast trays slide through slots, instant oatmeal, powdered milk, and a piece of bread. Meals last 10 minutes. Silence is mandatory. The prisoners eat, stare at the wall, and wait for the next hour of their existence to tick away. Even among guards, there's an unspoken rule: never show fear. Because fear, like scent to a predator, spreads fast. Inmates watch everything: your posture, your breathing, your hesitation. They can sense weakness even through a concrete wall. At 7 a.m., the prison's internal control center, known as the bubble, conducts its first security check. Every door lock, every surveillance feed, every motion sensor is reviewed. According to internal audits cited by the New York Times, 2015, ADX Florence runs more than 1,400 cameras simultaneously. The technology is military-grade: thermal imaging, motion detection, and AI-assisted pattern tracking. To outsiders, that level of control sounds futuristic. To those inside, it feels claustrophobic. Even a simple cough echoes like thunder through the ventilation ducts. At 9:15 a.m., a guard team prepares to escort a single inmate, one of the few allowed outside. It takes 6 officers to move him. Chains rattle. Doors unlock in sequence, one by one. The prisoner steps into a narrow tunnel leading to a concrete recreation pen, roughly the size of a parking space. No grass. No sky, just a mesh roof filtering sunlight like a cage over a laboratory rat. Here, recreation means 60 minutes of pacing in silence. No basketballs. No conversation. Just footsteps and wind. According to court filings in Rizak v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, 2020, former inmates described this routine as a life without time. Days blur together, one tray, one slot, one echo at a time. Back inside, the air feels heavy with disinfectant. The sound of metal doors clanging shut becomes the heartbeat of the facility. Inmates pass the time reading law books, counting cracks on the wall, or writing letters that may never be answered. By noon, the control center records hundreds of interactions, every movement logged, every action analyzed. Even the guards live under scrutiny. The system leaves no room for error, and no one, not even the warden, walks unobserved. But behind that rigid order lies something deeper: fear. Fear that one day, a single breach, a single malfunction, could unleash chaos that no wall could contain. In 2005, a malfunction in the door system trapped 2 guards inside a corridor for nearly 8 hours, according to an internal incident report later summarized by the Denver Post. No inmates escaped, but the event shook staff confidence. The illusion of perfection had cracked. Still, the next morning, operations resumed as if nothing had happened. Because at ADX Florence, the system never sleeps, and neither can the people running it. As dusk falls, the desert cools, and floodlights ignite. Shadows stretch across the compound like prison bars drawn by the sun itself. Inside those cells, men who once terrorized cities now whisper to the silence, counting days in lifetimes. And for the staff who guard them, every shift feels like living inside a ticking time bomb. One that never explodes, but never stops humming. The routine of madness. The second day begins long before sunrise, but in a place where there are no clocks, morning is just a rumor. Inside ADX Florence, time doesn't pass, it drips. Each minute feels heavier than the last, like sand falling through a narrow glass neck that never empties. At 5 a.m., the facility awakens to the sound of hydraulic locks disengaging in perfect rhythm, click, hiss, slam, like a mechanical heartbeat. Guards walk the halls with mirrored visors and gloves that never touch skin. They are trained to avoid eye contact, because even a glance can feel like giving away control. Every officer here knows the saying that circulates among correctional staff across the country. ADX doesn't punish the body, it punishes the mind. The cycle of isolation. Inmates at the supermax spend 22 to 23 hours a day alone, sealed in cells built to absorb sound. Walls are polished concrete, the ceiling low, the air filtered. The fluorescent lights never fully turn off, a constant, sterile glow that blurs the line between day and night. A 2017 Bureau of Justice Statistics report described the layout as architectural control over consciousness. Every design choice, from the angle of the mirror to the tint of the window slit, serves one purpose: containment. Breakfast is served through a small metal slot, oatmeal, maybe a slice of fruit if it's Thursday. It's not a meal, it's a ritual. Because in a place like this, routine becomes religion. At 8 a.m., the guards perform visual checks. Each inspection lasts less than 10 seconds per inmate. They look for movement, breathing, signs of self-harm. Many of the men inside have been diagnosed with severe mental illness, schizophrenia, depression, or PTSD, conditions worsened by sensory deprivation. In a 2014 federal lawsuit, Bacote v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, attorneys argued that ADX was not just a prison, but a psychological experiment in control. The complaint cited multiple cases of inmates mutilating themselves, screaming for hours, or smearing messages in blood on the walls. According to the filings, these were not isolated incidents, they were symptoms of the environment itself. "You don't go crazy here," one former inmate later wrote in a redacted letter leaked to reporters. "The place just teaches you what crazy feels like." The sound of nothing. By 10 a.m., the prison is silent. No footsteps. No conversation. Even the hum of electricity seems distant, a background whisper beneath concrete. For guards, this silence is a weapon and a warning. Because silence means control, but also unpredictability. When 400 men stop making noise, it means they're waiting. For what? No one knows. An internal training manual from 2016 warns new officers about the silence effect. It states, "Prolonged quiet is an operational hazard. Never assume compliance means calm." That's why guards are rotated frequently, never spending more than 2 weeks in one wing to prevent psychological fatigue. They call it burnout rotation. Still, the burnout rate remains among the highest in the Bureau of Prison system. Even the chaplain, in an interview later published by The Guardian, 2019, admitted, "You start talking to yourself in the hallways. That's when you know the place has gotten inside you." The human experiment. At noon, lunch is served. Sometimes it's beans and rice, sometimes macaroni. The portion is measured by calorie, not compassion. An inmate once described the food in a letter to his lawyer as tasting like metal and memory. Some prisoners, desperate for change, intentionally misbehave, throwing trays, flooding cells, just to be transferred to a disciplinary block where human interaction is slightly higher. Others withdraw completely. They stop speaking, stop eating, stop acknowledging reality. Psychologists call it institutional dissociation. In 2012, a Department of Justice report documented over 80 cases of extreme psychological breakdowns inside ADX Florence. According to the report, several inmates spent months under observation after showing signs of complete emotional disintegration. The The findings were disturbing enough to prompt international scrutiny, including a statement from the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, who argued that long-term solitary confinement beyond 15 days could be considered inhumane treatment. Inside the walls of ADX, that limit isn't 15 days, it's forever. Guarded by shadows. At 3 p.m., officers begin corridor sweeps. Every door, every lock, every light checked again. Each inspection is logged digitally, and any anomaly triggers a lockdown. One malfunction, a flickering bulb, a delayed door response, sends alarms echoing across the entire facility. In that moment, adrenaline spikes. Even the most veteran officers feel their hearts race. Because at ADX, no one assumes safety, only containment. An officer identified in federal training transcripts as Lieutenant C. Marsh once said, "It's not the inmates that get to you. It's the weight of the building itself. It presses on you." The mirror of control. By 6 p.m., lights dim slightly. It's not night, just simulation. Dinner comes, same slot, same silence. Inmates write letters that may take months to reach the outside world. Some keep journals filled with coded thoughts, knowing they'll be censored before mailing. Others speak through walls using a code of taps, a language born from necessity, passed through concrete like ghosts whispering in Morse. Guards hear the tapping but rarely intervene. It's the only sound that reminds them there are still humans behind those doors. By 9 p.m., the control center initiates the final sweep. Every camera feed reviewed, every light checked, every human accounted for. Then the facility falls into a deep artificial quiet, a silence thicker than darkness itself. But even when the lights go out, the cameras stay on. And somewhere inside the desert fortress, someone, inmate or officer, stares back at the lens, wondering if the world outside still remembers they exist. The men behind the walls. Behind every steel door at ADX Florence lies a story, some whispered, others buried under layers of concrete and silence. This is not a prison of names, it's a museum of consequences. Each man inside represents a piece of America's darkest history. Terrorism, organized crime, espionage, and madness. According to official Bureau of Prisons records, ADX houses offenders whose crimes are deemed too violent, too notorious, or too disruptive for standard maximum security facilities. But those cold bureaucratic words barely capture the reality of what that means. These are men who once held cities hostage, ran empires from prison cells, or orchestrated acts that changed national security forever. A cell for every legend. In one wing lies a man referred to by guards only as the Ghost. Convicted in the early 2000s under federal anti-terrorism statutes, his name remains sealed in classified court documents. He spends 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, monitored by infrared cameras even while sleeping. According to unclassified summaries, he hasn't spoken to another human face-to-face in over a decade. The last time he did, he told a psychologist, "I've become a shadow that remembers being human." In another unit, the notorious H unit, also known internally as the Life Wing, are men whose sentences guarantee they will die here. Among them are high-profile organized crime leaders, cartel lieutenants, and domestic terrorists whose names once dominated headlines. Some are still fighting legal battles. Others have accepted their fate in eerie calm. A former warden once said in an interview with 60 Minutes, "If the devil himself built a place to house his disciples, it would look like ADX." That quote, later echoed in The Atlantic, 2016, became a symbol of how the public views this facility, not as a prison but as an abyss. The codes of survival. But survival here is an art. Each man finds a ritual to cling to, a way to remain sane while living in what Amnesty International once called permanent sensory death. Some memorize books, page by page, line by line, until they can recite them from memory. One inmate reportedly read the Oxford English Dictionary front to back, then started over again. Another built a chessboard out of soap and crumbs, marking each piece with fingernail scratches. Every move he played was against himself. Guards who have worked at ADX long enough recognize patterns. One officer told the Denver Post, 2019. They create worlds in their heads. Some talk to them. Others start to believe they're real. To an outsider, it sounds like madness. Inside, it's adaptation. There's a saying among psychologists who've studied long-term solitary confinement. Humans can live without sunlight, but not without sound. That's why many inmates invent their own conversations. They talk to the air, to reflections, to voices that aren't there. And over time, the mind stops caring what's real, it just wants company. The Whisper Network. Communication here is forbidden, but not impossible. Inmates have developed elaborate methods to talk through the walls. Tapping, flushing toilets in code, or sliding notes under cell doors during cleaning rounds. In a 2018 investigative report by Mother Jones, guards described hearing strange rhythms echo through the plumbing, a kind of Morse code passed cell to cell. One retired officer said, "It's like they built their own internet, made of pipes and walls." Some of these whispered exchanges form bonds stronger than blood. Men who've never seen each other's faces share stories of their childhoods, crimes, regrets. They call each other brother or comrade. These invisible friendships are the only light they have left. But it's also how alliances form, and sometimes, conspiracies. In 2012, an internal security memo, later leaked during a FOIA release, revealed that at least 3 separate plots were intercepted through this wall code. None succeeded, but they proved that even total isolation couldn't stop communication, it only made it evolve. The psychology of powerlessness. By year 5, most inmates develop what psychologists term institutional dependency. They no longer resist the schedule, they submit to it. Their minds adapt to predict the next door sound, the next meal, the next voice from the intercom. They stop imagining the world beyond these walls. A federal psychiatrist, Dr. Craig Haney, who evaluated several ADX inmates, testified before Congress in 2014 that the deprivation of meaningful human contact leads to irreversible psychological harm. For many, it becomes a slow form of psychological death. That testimony shook the public, but changed little. The walls of ADX remained sealed, and the men behind them continued counting invisible days. Some inmates find religion. Others cling to the idea of revenge. One reportedly carved verses from the Quran into the wall using a spoon, another wrote the word freedom thousands of times until his fingers bled. Guards cleaned it, but he wrote it again, every day, for years. A senior psychologist at the facility once told a DOJ interviewer, "They all find something to believe in, even if it's hate. When the mind turns on itself." By the 6th year of confinement, hallucinations are common. Voices merge with memories. Some inmates claim to hear the hum of lights whispering their names. Others stare at the ceiling for hours, believing they can see patterns hidden in the texture of concrete. There's a story, confirmed by multiple staff accounts, of an inmate who began counting every letter in the Bible to pass the time. He made it to the book of Numbers before breaking down, convinced that each verse held a coded message from God. He stopped eating, stopped talking. By the time medical staff intervened, he had lost 40 pounds and all sense of reality. He was moved to the psychiatric observation unit, but even there, the sound of his whispering continued through the vents. "I can hear them," he kept saying. "They're everywhere." The guards' reflection. What's often forgotten is that the guards, too, are prisoners, of a different kind. They live in a world of endless surveillance and silence. Many suffer insomnia, anxiety, or emotional detachment after years of service. One former correctional officer admitted in a 2021 ProPublica interview, "You stop feeling empathy. You start mirroring what you see. The difference between the men behind the doors and those with the keys becomes thinner every day. And when the night finally falls over Florence, Colorado, it's not peace that fills the air. It's a suffocating stillness. Every camera blinks red. Every door locks twice. Inside 400 cells, men lie awake, haunted by the same question. How long can the human mind survive without being seen?" Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Information is drawn from verified public sources, including the Denver Post, 2019, 60 Minutes, Mother Jones, 2018, The Atlantic, 2016, and U.S. Congressional Testimony, 2014. The Guards Code, Fear, Power, and Paranoia. In ADX Florence, the inmates aren't the only ones serving invisible sentences. Every officer who walks through its steel gate signs an unspoken pact, to never break, to never flinch, and to never speak about what truly happens inside. The weight of the uniform. At 5:30 a.m., the first shift begins. The guards file through a series of biometric checkpoints, surrendering phones, watches, and anything that could connect them to the outside world. Even communication among staff is tightly regulated. Every movement is logged, every radio call recorded, every mistake noted. A correctional officer once told the Denver Post, 2018. "You don't leave the job at the gate. The walls follow you home." He wasn't exaggerating. The psychological toll on staff at ADX is so intense that the Federal Bureau of Prisons runs mandatory mental health briefings every quarter. Still, many refuse counseling, not because they don't need it, but because showing weakness in a place like this feels like inviting collapse. They call it guard fatigue. It starts small, insomnia, irritability, then grows into paranoia. Some begin dreaming in camera angles, reliving corridor patrols in their sleep. Others wake up in the middle of the night thinking they heard a door lock. According to a 2020 Department of Justice workforce assessment, ADX has one of the highest staff turnover rates of any federal facility, despite its prestige as the elite post of the correctional system. Because behind the rank and hazard pay lies something far more dangerous, the erosion of empathy. Power without humanity. Every rule inside ADX is designed to maintain one thing: absolute control. To accomplish that, guards must act as machines. They are forbidden from casual conversation with inmates. They don't call them by name, only by number. They deliver food, medication, and orders through steel slots, never touching a hand, never meeting a gaze. But over time, detachment turns into something darker. It becomes habit, a psychological armor. When empathy dies, fear takes its place. In an internal training transcript reviewed by The Guardian, 2019, a senior officer warns recruits. Never forget, the second you see them as human, you've already lost. For rookies, that warning feels like wisdom. For veterans, it feels like a confession. Some guards eventually stop speaking to each other altogether. They communicate through head nods, gestures, or clipped commands. The silence becomes contagious, spreading through the ranks like a virus. It's not loyalty. It's survival. Fear behind the mirror. The irony is that, despite their authority, guards at ADX often feel more trapped than the inmates they watch. Every door they open is controlled by someone else, another officer, another camera, another command center. They are watched, recorded, analyzed, and reported on just like the men they supervise. An anonymous officer wrote in a 2019 internal memo leaked to ProPublica. You start to forget who's really locked up. Us or them. The paranoia runs deep. A single procedural error can lead to immediate suspension. A late radio response can trigger a lockdown and an internal investigation. Every second counts. Every action is judged. In 2013, an officer mistakenly allowed two inmates to exchange brief words through their food slots. Within 48 hours, he was transferred to another facility, his career effectively over. No harm had occurred, but at ADX, the idea of chaos is treated like the act itself. The unseen enemy. Officers here don't just battle inmates, they battle the environment. The stillness, the fluorescent light, the absence of natural sound, it wears on the mind. Veterans describe the air itself as heavy with watching. A 2016 Bureau of Prisons psychological report noted that prolonged exposure to high-control, high-vigilance environments leads to symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress. Many guards experience anxiety, hypervigilance, and even hallucinations during off hours. Some begin to hear phantom intercom beeps or footsteps that aren't there. One former officer told The Atlantic, 2016. After 10 years, I couldn't stand silence anymore. I'd keep the TV on 24/7, not for noise, but to prove the world was still out there. Control breeds paranoia. For those who stay long enough, control becomes an addiction. They start craving it, needing it, even outside the walls. Some ex-staff have admitted to installing surveillance cameras in their homes, triple-checking locks, and timing their routines to the second. One psychologist who counseled former officers described it as institutional echo syndrome. They bring the rhythms of the prison into their personal lives, unable to turn them off. Inside ADX, even authority has limits. When officers walk past the thick, reinforced doors, they hear whispers, laughter, or quiet singing. They know those sounds are meant to get inside their heads, and sometimes, they do. "You can't see them, but they see you," said one officer during a DOJ debriefing. You start to imagine faces behind the steel. You wonder which pair of eyes are watching your shadow. The thin line between order and collapse. Every guard knows the stories, incidents the Bureau never publicized. Like the one in 2015, when an inmate smeared soap on his floor to make the guards slip during a cell extraction. Or the 2017 event, when a maintenance error caused a corridor door to unlock half a second early, nearly allowing physical contact between two high-risk inmates. No one was injured, but the aftershocks lasted weeks. Extra patrols. Endless paperwork. Mandatory retraining. At ADX, paranoia is policy. Every rumor becomes a potential threat, every sound becomes a warning. You never relax, because the moment you do, you've already lost control. And yet, most guards return the next day. They convince themselves it's duty, professionalism, or pride. But deep down, many admit it's something else, fear of leaving. Because once you've lived inside the most controlled environment on Earth, the outside world feels chaotic, unstructured, unsafe. Freedom becomes the thing you no longer trust. The reflection in the glass. When shift ends at midnight, officers file out the same way they came in, silent, expressionless, eyes fixed ahead. They swipe their ID badges, step into the night air, and breathe as if for the first time. But the wind feels strange. Too soft. Too real. They drive home through empty roads, headlights cutting through the Colorado dark. Some play music just to drown out the echo of the metal doors. Others drive in silence, still hearing them. And when they finally close their eyes, they see the same thing. A blinking red light on a camera lens, watching, recording, never sleeping. In that moment, they understand what the inmates have known all along. ADX doesn't just contain people. It consumes them. The breaking point, when silence turns violent. In a place built to suppress every spark of emotion, violence doesn't erupt often, but when it does, it's surgical, explosive, and unforgettable. At ADX Florence, every act of aggression is a message. Every drop of blood means control has slipped, if only for a second. The calm before the riot. It began like any other morning, silent corridors, cold light, the metallic rhythm of order. But inside one of the H-unit cells, a man had reached the end of his endurance. His name is redacted in official records, but officers called him Inmate 122. He'd spent 14 years in near-total isolation, serving life without parole for multiple counts of violent assault. According to a 2019 Bureau of Prisons internal review, the inmate had shown increasing signs of psychological collapse, insomnia, paranoia, and auditory hallucinations. He told staff he could hear the walls breathing. They wrote it off as another delusion. But that morning, the walls finally answered. At 9:42 a.m., a food tray slid through his slot, scrambled eggs, toast, and a carton of milk. He refused it. 10 minutes later, he pressed the emergency intercom. The guard on rotation ignored it. False alarms are common. Then came the second press, longer, sharper, insistent. By the third, the officer knew something was off. When they opened the door. Under full restraint protocol, the cell was drenched in chaos. The inmate had shattered his mirror, using the shards to carve words into the wall. "I am still here." What followed was recorded in the incident logs as Code Black, psychological hostage situation. For nearly 4 hours, the man refused medical aid, bleeding quietly as he repeated the same phrase again and again. The control team used non-lethal gas to subdue him. He survived, physically. Mentally, no one knows. One officer who participated in the extraction later wrote anonymously to the Intercept, 2020. It wasn't rage. It was desperation. Like he needed to prove he still existed. That moment became legend among the staff, a reminder that even the most secure system in the world can't cage the human mind forever. When control cracks. There are no riots at ADX, not in the way most imagine. No fires, no mob chaos, no shouting in corridors. Here, violence is quiet, almost elegant. It unfolds like a fault line beneath polished stone. In 2008, two inmates in separate wings coordinated what officials later called a synchronized breach. Using coded flushes and taps, they timed their recreation periods to attack simultaneously, one on a guard, one on himself. The diversion forced a full lockdown. No one died, but it exposed the prison's Achilles heel, communication. A Department of Justice report, 2011, concluded. Despite total isolation, inmates maintain a covert network capable of synchronized action. The system is secure, not infallible. That phrase, not infallible, haunted administrators for years. Because ADX was designed to be perfect. But perfection can't anticipate madness. The guard's perspective. Officers train for everything: riots, suicides, assaults, even coordinated protests. What they can't train for is the silence that follows. After an incident, the facility goes dead quiet. No one moves. Every sound, even a breath, feels amplified. One senior lieutenant described the aftermath of a 2015 lockdown. You can feel the whole building holding its breath. Like it's alive, waiting. For days after, inmates lose privileges: no rec, no mail, no showers. Punishment through deprivation. But for men already buried in silence, that's like punishing darkness with more dark. It doesn't deter them, it drives them further inward. Psychologists who've studied ADX incidents often compare these outbreaks to pressure valves. As Dr. Craig Haney explained in a U.S. Senate testimony, 2014. When you compress a human being beyond the limit of endurance, violence is not rebellion, it's a symptom of survival. The case of the vanishing officer. Not every violent episode leaves visible scars. Some disappear into bureaucratic fog, classified as administrative matters. One such case, unsealed years later through a Freedom of Information Act request, involved a correctional officer who vanished after a confrontation in 2016. According to the declassified report, the officer, unnamed for security reasons, was last seen leaving H Unit after an unlogged cell inspection. No foul play was ever confirmed, but his security badge was found near a ventilation shaft 2 hours later. The official cause? Procedural miscommunication. Unofficially, officers whispered something different. They said he'd gone into the tunnels that run beneath the facility, narrow maintenance routes connecting power systems, and never came back out. Of course, there's no proof. Only the lingering rumor that somewhere under Florence, a tunnel still echoes with a single footstep that never stops. Psychological eruptions. For psychologists inside ADX, the hardest part isn't preventing violence, it's predicting it. Inmates often appear calm, emotionless, even polite, until they snap without warning. A former mental health coordinator described it to the Washington Post, 2017, as the stillness before lightning. In one documented case, an inmate spent years quietly drawing elaborate murals of his childhood home, thousands of pencil lines covering every inch of his paper. Then one morning, without provocation, he shredded every drawing, screaming that the walls were erasing his memories. He was placed under suicide watch for 6 months. Another inmate, a convicted cartel enforcer, began collecting crumbs of bread, arranging them into patterns he believed could short-circuit the security cameras. When the staff cleared his cell, he broke his own finger in protest. He told them, "You can take my food, but not my code." Each episode becomes a file, a statistic, a warning. But together, they tell one truth: even in a place designed to crush rebellion, the mind keeps fighting back. The system rewrites itself. After every violent incident, ADX changes. New rules, tighter surveillance, stricter rotations. The prison evolves like a living organism, learning, adapting, fortifying. But each adaptation brings a cost. More automation means fewer human interactions. Fewer interactions mean deeper isolation. And deeper isolation breeds the very instability the system fears. A 2021 Human Rights Watch report summarized it bluntly. ADX is a paradox, a prison that creates the behavior it was built to prevent. By the time night falls over the Rockies, the cycle resets. The hum of fluorescent lights returns. The cameras blink red again. Somewhere deep inside the compound, a man whispers into the vent, tapping a code that means only one thing: still here. And in the control room, a weary officer hears it. But doesn't press mute. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Information is drawn from verified public sources, including the Intercept, 2020, Department of Justice Reports, 2011, The Washington Post, 2017, Human Rights Watch, 2021, and U.S. Congressional Testimony, 2014. The Mind Unravels, Solitary Confinement and Madness. Inside ADX Florence, sanity isn't lost overnight. It erodes, grain by grain, until nothing recognizable remains. Men don't go insane here with screams or chaos. They dissolve quietly, like salt in water. And by the time anyone notices, what's left is only a shape, human in outline, hollow within. The science of isolation. According to neuroscientists who've studied long-term solitary confinement, the human brain is built for stimulation, sight, sound, touch, interaction. When those vanish, the brain begins to turn on itself. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist who examined multiple ADX inmates for a federal case in 2012, explained it this way. Solitary confinement produces a specific psychiatric syndrome, anxiety, hallucinations, panic, loss of impulse control, and paranoia. It's a predictable neurological reaction, not a mystery. MRI studies published in Nature Neuroscience, 2019, confirm his words. Brains deprived of social and sensory input start rewiring themselves. Regions responsible for empathy and reasoning shrink. Areas tied to fear and aggression expand. In other words, the mind starts to eat itself. At ADX Florence, these changes aren't theory, they're routine. Officers have watched inmates talk to mirrors for hours, convinced there's someone on the other side. Others rock back and forth, whispering apologies to voices only they can hear. And some, according to court records from Baycoat v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, 2014, lose the ability to tell dreams from memory. I keep waking up inside the same dream, one inmate wrote in a letter later filed in court. Except it's not a dream. It's breakfast. Psychosis by design. The cells in ADX are engineered for control, smooth concrete walls, minimal edges, and a single window slit angled toward the sky so inmates can't see the horizon. But psychologists argue that same design produces spatial deprivation, a condition that distorts depth perception and time awareness. Inmates begin misjudging distances, imagining movement where there is none. Some report the sensation of floating or shrinking. A former mental health coordinator told The Guardian, 2020. After a few years, they stop pacing. They just stand still. It's like their bodies forget motion. Even routine activities, eating, sleeping, showering, lose meaning. Every action becomes mechanical. The mind, desperate for novelty, starts creating it, hallucinations born from the absence of real life. A veteran officer recalled an inmate who swore that the light in his cell was breathing. He'd time his meals and exercises to its rhythm. When the maintenance crew changed the bulb, he collapsed, screaming that they'd killed his only friend. That detail never made it into the official report. Letters from the edge. Every week, a handful of inmates are allowed to send monitored letters. Most never reach their recipients, many are intercepted for content review. But some, leaked through legal filings, provide chilling windows into the psychology of isolation. One letter, obtained by the New York Times, 2015, reads: "The silence gets inside your blood. You can hear your own pulse. You start waiting for it to stop, just to hear something different." Another, from a prisoner who'd spent 18 years in ADX, said, "Sometimes I talk out loud just so my voice doesn't forget me." Psychiatrists describe this as identity decay. The brain, deprived of feedback from other people, begins to forget the self. You can remember your name, your number, your crime, but not who you are. By the 10th year of isolation, even memories warp. Faces of family blur. Dreams become indistinguishable from flashbacks. The human mind, stripped of contact, starts looping, replaying fragments of old life until they rot from repetition. The doctors who watch. The irony is brutal. ADX employs psychologists, but their access is limited to brief, cell-front evaluations. They stand outside steel doors, speaking through food slots, observing behavior through narrow glass. Their tools are checklists. Their diagnoses, often based on silence. A 2017 Department of Justice oversight report noted that several inmates were listed as stable weeks before suicide attempts. Because silence, in this place, masquerades as compliance. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, a clinical consultant who visited the facility under court order, described it bluntly. The staff are not treating patients, they're monitoring decay. The sound of collapse. At night, the psychological unraveling becomes audible. Taps, mutters, rhythmic thuds against steel. Guards call it the music of the units. It's not communication, it's coping. Each sound is a heartbeat in a world where nothing moves. One former correctional officer told ProPublica, 2019. When the lights go out, that's when you really hear the madness. It's not loud, it's soft, steady, endless. Like rain that never stops. Over the years, these sounds have become part of the building's identity, a language made of suffering. New officers learn to tune it out. Veterans can't. They carry it home, hearing phantom tapping in their sleep. When the mind breaks open. There are inmates who resist the spiral, at first. They exercise obsessively, memorize poetry, or study law from outdated textbooks. But time is the undefeated enemy. One day, the focus fractures. An inmate in E-Unit once began quoting Shakespeare to the ventilation system. For 3 years, he recited Hamlet daily, believing the vents carried his words to the outside world. When a new HVAC system was installed, cutting off the echo, he stopped eating and was found unresponsive 2 weeks later. Another, a former mob enforcer, spent years collecting paper scraps to map his cell. He believed that if he drew it enough times, he could change its size. When the guards confiscated the papers, he asked, "How big am I now?" These are not isolated cases, they are patterns of what solitary does when it outlives purpose. The walls remember. What no one tells the public is that the walls of ADX bear witness. Underneath layers of fresh paint, faint carvings remain, initials, prayers, desperate words. Some say the walls hum at night, vibrating with decades of whispers. Of course, scientifically, it's just airflow and pressure differentials. But for those inside, it's memory, the ghosts of every mind that couldn't hold on. In 2021, during a rare facility audit, a technician noted hearing reverberations in the concrete that resembled faint human murmurs. The report dismissed it as an acoustic anomaly. But officers who've worked there longer have a different theory. The building remembers the people who break inside it. And maybe they're right. Because when you walk through ADX long enough, you start to feel watched, not by cameras, but by the silence itself. Inside the program, breaking isolation and the fight for reform. For nearly 3 decades, ADX Florence stood untouchable, a fortress of silence, immune to scrutiny. But nothing stays buried forever. By the late 2010s, cracks began to form, not in the walls, but in the conscience of the system itself. Lawyers, journalists, and human rights investigators started asking the question no one inside dared to voice aloud. What if control has gone too far? The spark of rebellion, from inside the system. It started quietly. A handful of correctional psychologists began submitting internal memos warning that the facility was, operationally unsustainable. One of them, whose identity remains confidential in DOJ archives, wrote in 2016. ADX has perfected control but destroyed correction. There is no rehabilitation here, only containment. Around the same time, a lawsuit filed by several inmates, Rizak vs. Federal Bureau of Prisons, 2020, gained national attention. The plaintiffs were men held for decades in solitary confinement. Their argument was simple but powerful. We are not asking for freedom. We are asking to be treated as human. The case forced the Bureau of Prisons to defend its policies before a federal judge, marking one of the first serious challenges to America's supermax model. Court filings cited medical records showing elevated rates of psychosis, self-harm, and suicide among long-term ADX prisoners. Even the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, intervened, stating that the conditions may amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. For the first time, the most secretive prison in America was under a global microscope. The Bureau's dilemma. Behind closed doors, the Bureau of Prisons faced an impossible paradox. If they admitted that ADX Florence's methods were harmful, they would be confessing to systemic abuse. If they denied it, they risked international condemnation and legal defeat. The compromise came disguised as progress, a new initiative known as the step-down program. Officially introduced in 2013 but expanded after litigation pressure, it was designed to transition inmates from total isolation into gradually increasing levels of interaction and privilege. Each phase required demonstrated compliance, good behavior, participation in therapy, and adherence to rules. In theory, it was a path toward redemption. In practice, it was another maze of control. One prisoner described it to the Marshall Project, 2019, as freedom on a leash you can't see. Participation meant admitting guilt for past behavior, even if you hadn't broken any rules. Refusal meant permanent solitary confinement. And so, many inmates signed forms they didn't understand, chasing a promise that never arrived. Therapy through steel. To the Bureau, the step-down program was evidence of reform. To critics, it was psychological theater. Therapy sessions took place through reinforced glass, inmates in shackles, psychologists seated behind metal grates. Sessions lasted 30 minutes. The official curriculum included anger management, social skills training, and cognitive reframing. But as one mental health specialist told the Washington Post, 2020, you can't teach empathy through a steel door. The irony was staggering. Men deprived of human contact were being asked to demonstrate emotional intelligence. Inmates began playing the game, saying what staff wanted to hear just to advance phases. One wrote in a letter later published by Human Rights Watch, 2021. They want us to act human after taking our humanity away. Voices from the outside. As the lawsuits multiplied, so did the public attention. Documentaries, investigative podcasts, and advocacy campaigns began shedding light on the hidden cost of America's obsession with security. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International and the ACLU demanded congressional oversight, calling ADX a monument to psychological suffering. In 2019, a bipartisan coalition of lawmakers, led by Senators Dick Durbin and Chris Coons, introduced the Solitary Confinement Reform Act, seeking to limit isolation to 15 consecutive days in federal facilities. The bill cited findings from neuroscience and mental health studies showing that prolonged sensory deprivation causes permanent damage. Though the bill stalled in committee, it forced a national conversation that the Bureau could no longer ignore. The internal resistance. Surprisingly, some of the loudest critics came from within ADX itself. A handful of former guards and wardens began speaking anonymously to journalists, describing the institution as a psychological meat grinder. One retired lieutenant told ProPublica, 2020. It's not just breaking the inmates, it's breaking everyone who works there. His testimony echoed the sentiment of a growing movement among correctional staff demanding better mental health training and less exposure to extreme environments. Some even advocated for closing parts of the facility entirely, arguing that permanent lockdown violated the core principles of justice. For years, those voices were ignored. But as staff suicides and burnout rates climbed, the Bureau started listening, quietly, reluctantly, but undeniably. Moments of humanity. In 2022, a small but significant change began, the Human Contact Initiative. Under strict supervision, certain inmates were allowed limited group sessions, 2 or 3 men in a secured enclosure, overseen by officers. For some, it was the first time they had spoken face-to-face with another prisoner in over a decade. One participant described the experience to the Denver Post, 2023. It felt like meeting a stranger who spoke my language after years of silence. He later said he couldn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because he'd forgotten what another man's voice sounded like. That moment, small, fragile, human, marked the first crack in ADX's philosophy of total control. The reformers struggle. Despite these changes, reformers still face resistance. Many within the Bureau argue that ADX remains essential, the final barrier against chaos in the federal system. They point to inmates who have killed guards, assaulted staff, or led criminal networks from behind bars. They insist that some people can never live among others. But human rights experts counter that even the worst among us remain human. Dr. Craig Haney, testifying again in 2022, put it bluntly. Solitary confinement doesn't just punish, it erases. And a justice system that erases people is one that loses its own soul. The debate continues, between security and humanity, between order and empathy. And ADX Florence stands at the center of it, an unblinking monument to the question America still refuses to answer. How much control is too much? A flicker in the dark. Today, the step-down program remains in place. Some inmates have transitioned to lower security units. Others remain locked in silence, forgotten in concrete tombs. But whispers of change persist. More journalists are granted partial access. More data is declassified. And somewhere deep inside the facility, a therapist still kneels by a steel door, saying quietly through the slot, "You're still here. You're still human." For a moment, even the cameras seem to pause. As if the walls themselves are listening. The outside eyes, journalists, whistleblowers, and the secrets that escaped. For decades, ADX Florence existed in myth, a place whispered about but rarely seen, wrapped in secrecy and steel. Reporters called it the black hole of the federal system. Politicians referenced it as proof of America's toughness on crime. But almost no one knew what it truly looked like inside. That began to change when a few brave voices, guards, lawyers, and even former inmates, started talking. Not loudly, but persistently. And those whispers would grow into an avalanche of truth that the Bureau of Prisons could no longer bury. The wall of silence breaks. In 2018, an anonymous package arrived at the newsroom of the Intercept. It contained photocopies of internal incident reports, mental health assessments, and sealed memos from the Bureau's Denver regional office. Stamped across the top of many pages were two words: restricted access. The documents described suicide attempts, cover-ups, and falsified mental health evaluations. They revealed that several inmates listed as stable had, in fact, been under suicide watch within weeks of their classification. One memo, written by a senior psychologist, read, "We are not treating them. We are containing them. The system is breaking men faster than we can record it." The Bureau dismissed the leak as selective misrepresentation. But journalists had finally found a crack, and through it, they began pulling an entire history into daylight. The whistleblower from within. A few months later, a correctional officer identified only as Mark D. came forward under whistleblower protection. He had worked at ADX for over 12 years. His testimony, first aired in a 60-minute segment, was blunt and unforgettable. "The system isn't about control anymore," he said. "It's about fear. We're afraid of the inmates are afraid of us, and the administration is afraid of the truth." He described watching men mutilate themselves, beg for human contact, and deteriorate under constant isolation. He claimed that internal reports of abuse were routinely sanitized before being sent to Washington. "You don't file a complaint," he said. "You file a career suicide note." After the segment aired, the Bureau of Prisons issued a formal statement denying any wrongdoing. But they quietly reassigned several senior staff members at ADX Florence in the weeks that followed. The power of the pen. Journalists from the New York Times, ProPublica, and the Marshall Project began collaborating, piecing together a mosaic of first-hand accounts and leaked documents. For the first time, the public saw ADX not as an abstract symbol of justice, but as a human experiment gone wrong. A Pulitzer-nominated ProPublica feature titled "The Prison That Forgot the World Outside," published in 2020, detailed a series of suicides that had never been publicly acknowledged. It cited evidence that guards were pressured to falsify log entries showing cell checks that never actually happened. The report quoted one anonymous mental health worker. "They call it America's most secure prison, but they can't secure the truth." Soon after, major international outlets, BBC, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, echoed the story. ADX Florence was no longer invisible. It had become a global symbol of human rights controversy. The survivors speak. A few former inmates who successfully completed the step-down program began sharing their stories through lawyers and advocacy groups. Their testimonies were haunting. One, who had spent 17 years inside, told The Guardian, 2021. "You don't realize how fragile your mind is until silence starts answering your thoughts." Another survivor described hearing voices for months after release, echoes of guards, doors, and intercom clicks that never stopped. He said the hardest part of freedom wasn't adjusting to people, it was trusting space. "Open air scared me. I'd never felt so exposed." Psychiatrists confirmed what he described: post-isolation syndrome, a combination of PTSD, sensory hypersensitivity, and social withdrawal. According to a 2021 study from Yale Law School, nearly 80% of long-term supermax survivors develop lasting mental health issues. One man, who once served a sentence alongside domestic terrorists and cartel leaders, summarized it best. ADX didn't punish me for what I did. It punished me for being alive. The global reaction. The exposés triggered outrage across human rights circles. The United Nations Human Rights Council called for an independent review of U.S. supermax facilities, citing ADX as a case study in psychological cruelty. In Europe, several countries began refusing to extradite suspects to the U.S. unless the government guaranteed they wouldn't be sent to ADX Florence. In 2021, a British High Court cited inhumane risk factors at ADX as part of its reasoning for initially blocking the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. That ruling was later overturned, but the warning remained clear. Even America's allies were beginning to see ADX not as a fortress of justice, but as a symbol of moral decay. Meanwhile, advocacy groups launched the hashtag #CloseADX campaign, gathering over 200,000 signatures. Their demand wasn't just to shut down the prison, but to redefine justice itself. The Bureau's counterattack. Under pressure, the Bureau of Prisons launched a public relations effort titled Security with Humanity. It highlighted the step-down program, new staff mental health initiatives, and improvements to inmate communication. But behind the glossy language, little had changed. A 2022 Government Accountability Office (GAO) audit quietly revealed that suicide watch protocols were still inconsistent and that staff shortages had reached critical levels. One internal email, later leaked to the Intercept, summarized the truth bluntly. We are not reforming the system. We are rebranding it. For every story the Bureau released about progress, another leak exposed the opposite. The courage of the few. Despite threats, lawsuits, and pressure, journalists kept digging. Some faced intimidation. One reporter from the Marshall Project discovered her FOIA requests were mysteriously delayed for months. Another's personal email was hacked after publishing a story about a whistleblower. But the truth had momentum now, and momentum doesn't need permission. By 2023, the story of ADX Florence had evolved from a local controversy into a cultural reckoning. Documentaries streamed on Netflix, Hulu, and HBO Max. Books were published by former staffers and legal activists. Even Hollywood adapted parts of the story into films and limited series. For once, the narrative didn't glorify crime, it questioned the cost of control. The price of telling the truth. Whistleblowers like Mark D. were eventually forced to relocate for safety. Some guards who corroborated his accounts lost pensions, others faced administrative retaliation. Yet, even years later, many say they'd do it again. Because silence, they realized, was the real prison. As Mark told an interviewer in 2024, I spent 12 years locking people away, and it took me 12 more to see I was locked up too. His words became a rallying cry for reformers, quoted in documentaries and advocacy campaigns alike. For the first time in its history, ADX Florence wasn't just a fortress, it was a mirror. One that reflected America's darkest obsession, control at any cost. The unfinished story. Even now, new leaks continue to surface, updated reports, internal memos, disciplinary files. They reveal a system still struggling to balance power and conscience. And every revelation raises the same question that's haunted ADX since its birth in 1994. Can a prison built to destroy connection ever truly be reformed? The journalists think they already know the answer. The Bureau insists the world will never understand. And somewhere inside those concrete walls, the cameras still blink red. Watching, recording, remembering. The final 24 hours, life, death, and the legacy of ADX Florence. For most people, 24 hours means a day, a sunrise, a meal, a conversation, a chance to start over. Inside ADX Florence, 24 hours can feel like a lifetime. For some, it is the last one they'll ever live. Morning, the countdown begins. The day begins at 5 a.m. As always, a low hum, a metallic click, a flash of fluorescent light. But this day feels different. There's no official record of executions here, ADX isn't a death row facility. Yet men die all the same, by their own hands, or by time itself. One inmate, known in court filings only as D512, had been at ADX for 19 years. He was serving life for multiple murders, but over the years his defiance had faded into routine. According to internal memos obtained by the Intercept, 2022, he'd recently refused meals and stopped responding to staff. On his final morning, he wrote one line on a piece of toilet paper. "You can't kill what's already forgotten." By 8:15 a.m., he was gone, found unresponsive in his cell, the same cell where he'd lived nearly 2 decades. The official report listed suicide by asphyxiation. Unofficially, officers called it the quiet death. His passing barely made a ripple. No alarms, no headlines. At ADX, even death happens in silence. Afternoon, the machine keeps running. The body was removed before noon. Within an hour, the cell had been sanitized, repainted, and reassigned a number. By protocol, the event was logged as medical emergency resolved. Operations continued without pause, meals delivered, checks performed, doors sealed. Because ADX doesn't stop for grief. It swallows it whole. A psychologist on duty that day wrote in her notes, "I felt nothing. I think that's the point." Elsewhere in the facility, another inmate marked the death in his own way, tapping 3 slow beats on his wall, a code that meant gone. Others heard it, answered with 3 taps back. It was the only funeral ADX would ever allow. Evening, reflections behind the glass. At 7 p.m., as the sun fell behind the Rockies, a veteran guard stood at his post in the control center, watching 400 camera feeds flicker in perfect rhythm. He'd been here 21 years, long enough to outlast 5 wardens and 3 reforms. He looked at the monitors and saw ghosts, men he'd escorted, subdued, watched vanish into paperwork. He once believed ADX kept the world safe. Now, he wasn't sure what it had saved at all. "You start thinking," he told a journalist later, "maybe the walls were built to keep something in us, not just them." That night, he requested transfer to another facility. It was denied. Night, the living prison. When darkness falls over Florence, Colorado, the prison becomes a sea of artificial stars, red surveillance lights blinking in endless symmetry. Inside, the men dream in fragments, doors, footsteps, memories of rain. Some whisper prayers. Some talk to the air. Some don't speak at all. And somewhere in the control room, the cameras record it all, every breath, every movement, every silent plea for something beyond these walls. The hum of ventilation becomes the only sound left. It's the same hum heard by inmates 20 years ago. The same one that will echo 20 years from now. The rhythm of a system that cannot feel, only function. Legacy beyond the fence. When the first concrete blocks were poured in 1994, the architects called ADX the end of the line. They didn't know they were also building a monument, not to justice, but to fear. Today, psychologists use it as a case study. Human rights lawyers cite it in arguments before international courts. Even the Bureau of Prisons no longer calls it a model. They call it necessary. But necessary is a fragile word. Because necessity is how cruelty survives respectably. In 2024, a former ADX inmate, one of the few to complete the step-down program and re-enter society, testified before Congress. He said, simply, "I left the prison, but the prison didn't leave me." He paused, looked up at the cameras broadcasting the hearing, and added, "You don't fix ADX by tearing down walls. You fix it by remembering the people still breathing behind them." His words went viral, shared millions of times across social media. For a brief moment, the world listened. Then, as always, it moved on. The final hours. At midnight, ADX resets itself, doors lock, lights dim, data is archived. The same routine, the same hum, the same illusion of control. Another 24 hours begin. Outside, the desert sleeps under a cold Colorado moon. Inside, the most dangerous men in America lie awake. Not plotting escape. Not dreaming of freedom. But listening to the same endless hum. The sound of a system that outlasts them all. And in that hum lives the real legacy of ADX Florence. Not violence, not justice. But silence itself. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Information is drawn from verified public sources, including the Intercept, 2022, ProPublica, 2020, The Guardian, 2021, U.S. Bureau of Prisons Internal Summaries, and U.S. Congressional Testimonies on Solitary Confinement, 2024.